This is the origins of agriculture and the Garden of Eden. It's the second part. The first part we dealt with Christian O'Brien's Levantine Corridor thesis, which is based very largely on all the textual evidence, history books, his geology and many different skills, where he located the origins of agriculture and the Garden of Eden below Mount Hermon in the Rashaya or Ahia Basin, which is in southern Lebanon. And this is part 2 of that Learning from History part 14 presentation. So now we're dealing with domestication as such. We're looking at all the scientific evidence and all that's been put together by many different people with many different skills again, but dealing more specifically with the crops themselves and where they were grown and the dates they were grown. Now, knowledge of the domestication of crops and animals provides the best scientific evidence of the activities and original location of our advanced and benevolent ancestors, together with the dates of their restart of agriculture and progress around the world. What is key to agriculture over the past 50,000 or so years is climate change, would you believe? The rate of temperature change over 100-year intervals back to 47,927 BC to the present day. Conditions for agriculture were hostile until the end of the Great Younger Dryas Ice Age, which can be seen very clearly on this chart. Now, the reason for this, and I dealt with it in previous Learning from Histories, was a supernova explosion at around 39,000 BC, which flashed the whole Earth from the direction, the other side of the Earth, from here in Australia. And that's where we get the extinction of the giant kangaroo at that date. And then we had a whole series of problems following up on that. And then the very biggest problem for the planet was all the lumps of debris, gases, ice, everything else, all the solid and heavy elements of whatever was the supernova that exploded, actually blasting through our solar system and creating mayhem. And that's dealt with very well with Allen and Dare in their book Cataclysm. So by the time we get to 9,500 BC, we end what is called Great Younger Dryas Ice Age and start what is called the Holocene, the wholly recent period of time. Now, the conventional views accepted by so many people now is that agriculture started exactly in the area we're talking about and the area that was precisely identified by Christian O'Brien. And this is from Malta Before History, which is a book I recommend, and it was forwarded by Colin Renfrew, who is now Lord Renfrew, one of our leading archaeologists. And you can see here, starting at 9,500, Cyprus 8,000, Crete 7,500, Greece 7,000, Sardinia 5,500, and then Spain 5,500, Northern Europe about 5,500. But England itself, the earliest evidence we have is side fields on the west coast of Ireland, where a very large area was cleared of trees and turned into a very extensive farming area by people who were acting with central organisation and very well organised, just as the city-states were. So we have here a city-state group migrating to Ireland and starting again there. But in the case of side fields, the weather changed, and we went from the Holocene optimum at 4,200 to a very cold period, and during that time and over time generally, side fields is now covered with 5 or 6 feet of peat. And the Holocene optimum, when everything was going so well in the land of Sumer and there were big migrations of people, the temperature was 2 degrees warmer than it is today in Britain, with double the rainfall. That's an important point to make in this diffusion of agriculture from the Near East, and not only to Britain and Europe, but also around the whole world. This is the molecular genetic evidence for the spread of farming into Europe. again a clear message of gradual diffusion from the Near East. This is a very important work again by Lord Renfrew, Language, Origins and Farming Dispersals. And here it's called The Concrete Example. The hypothetical nuclear area contains the homelands of 4 proto-languages, which are shaded in this diagram. It is hypothesized that farming dispersal processes led to the later distribution of the following language families. 1. Afro-Asiatic, 2. Elamo-Dravidian, 3. Indo-European, and 4. Altaic. It should be noted that the hypothetical Nostratic macro family contains all 4 language families, and that the homeland indicated may be the homeland of Proto-Nostratic around 10,000 BC. I did speak to him about this and ask him, I said, why don't you join them all together and see the origin being in the Levantine Corridor? He said, well, we haven't got far yet. But anyway, it was an interesting point, and I did have a chance to talk to him. He is a notable character in our world of archaeology. Much later now, we're talking about the latest research on looking for the origin of agriculture, and it's actually titled 10 Probable Centres of Origin of Agriculture, dated 2007, and is research carried out, very important research carried out by Ron Van Haase, Joachim Fort and Albert Ammerman. And here they've got 10 black dots, and they're all considered to be the important places which should be considered as the origin of agriculture. Now I'm going to refine my presentation to you to look at those black dots and work out which are the most relevant in terms of locating the origin of agriculture. You can see here Catalhaya, Kayanu, Abu Huraira, Ali Kosh. They're all in the northern side of the Tigris and Euphrates, Anatolia, and I'm going to deal with that northern area a bit later on. I'm going to want to concentrate on Aswad and Jericho, which is strictly the Levantine Corridor. So let's look at these early sites of human settlement. This is a map of the Natufian sites, approximately 12,500, 10,000 BC, and it's from The Birth of the Gods and Origins of Agriculture by the very well-known Jacques. So here we have signs of early settlements of people, hunter-gatherers, gathering together and in settled villages, but relying on hunter-gathering. And maybe too they relied on eating seeds that they collected. But remember that the wild seeds are quite different to the domesticated seeds. Map of villages belonging to the pre-pottery Neolithic A period, which here is described as 9,500 to 8,800 BC. These dates, and all the dates I'm talking about, are having to be refined and altered all the time because of new discoveries and new information. Here we have, in that important area that I've talked about, we've got Tel Aswad, which gives rise to the name Aswadian, although that has been removed from the record now. It's all that Levantine corridor. And the Sultanian, which is Nahal Oren, Netiv, Hagud, Jericho, Kayam. And they're all just by the Dead Sea there, as you can see, and they run up to the Lebanon. And Aswad, in fact, is literally a mile or two from Damascus, and Damascus is 25 miles from Karsag, just the other side of the anti-Lebanon. Now this is, again, maps of villages belonging to the early and middle pre-pottery Neolithic B. And B is, it's the difference between A and B is where we begin to find possible signs of agriculture. And it just shows the expansion of settlements here, but still nothing very dramatic. And they've described it here as the early PP&B, middle PP&B, and it doesn't really tackle what we're trying to find out is where agriculture started. But we do then begin to find out post-domestication, we know from the dates of the crops that were domesticated, there was a sudden explosion in the number of villages and the size of those villages, what you would expect when agriculture was invented. It had such a dramatic effect upon the communities where it was practiced. And here we have a big diffusion of agriculture out into Anatolia and the Zagros Mountains, but we have the highest concentration closely together in this Levantine corridor between Aswad and which goes through Jordan, and the southerly one here is Basta. Now, the world's leading specialist in agricultural origins is Professor Daniel Zachary from the Jerusalem University. And here's what he says about this subject. Crop assemblage in the early Neolithic farming villages in Southwest Asia before 7,700. That's a recalibrated radiocarbon date. Black squares indicate the earliest sites dated to the 9th millennium. Black circles, later dates. Short whisker rare, long whisker common. And he identifies in particular a concentration at Tal Aswad, Ramad, Ein Gazal, Jericho, Beda, and Yafaya, El. So if we just blow that up and look at that, what have we got there? We're looking here at einhorn wheat, emmer wheat, barley, chickpea, flax, lentil, pea, and bitter vetch. And you can see that the two principal squares are at Tel Aswad and Jericho, where we find the earliest dates for these crops. This is what Daniel Zachary says. In conclusion, the available data, fragmentary as they are, appear to support the hypothesis that development of grain agriculture in Southwest Asia was triggered in each crop by a single domestication event, or at most by very few such events. However, although such mode of origin is indicated for the majority of the founder crops, the data tells us very little about the way the Southwest Asian Neolithic crop package was assembled. It remains an open question as to whether these crops were taken into cultivation together in the same place, or whether different crops were domesticated, perhaps each only once in different places. He goes on, yet once the technology of crop cultivation was invented and the domesticated forms of wheats, barleys, pulses and flax first appeared, they probably spread over the Near Eastern arc in a manner similar to the way in which they later spread into Europe, not by additional domestications in each species, but by diffusion of the already existing domesticates. In other words, soon after the first non-shattering and early germinating cereals, pulses and flax was here, their superior performance under cultivation became decisive, and there was no need for repeated domestication of wild progenitors. Moreover, because this new system of crop cultivation expanded rapidly, there was little chance for grain agriculture to develop independently elsewhere in Southwest Asia or Europe. This is apparently true not only for the Neolithic founder crops, but also for the first Southwest Asian domesticated herd animals, sheep and the goat. Sheep, goat and pigs were found at Jericho. A major part of their diet at Jericho before domestication, believe it or not, the largest quantity of animals was the fox, the red fox. Now the wild auroch, I've included this slide because all the cattle, all are related to the wild auroch. And as you can see, they're very much smaller versions of the wild auroch, and they have a much more kinder temperament than the wild auroch, which was a very fierce animal. And if you were farming in England or anywhere in the British Isles, you had to have a very significant system of earthworks and banks and fences to be able to stop the wild auroch breaking things down and chasing after your young heifers. All the animals which were domesticated, like the crops, were very different from the original progenitor. And here we're looking at, again, extraordinary skills in genetic modifications and changes to these animals, which are quite different to their wild relatives. Wonderful picture here from India. We have a tall Indian, but very small cattle, very easy to handle. The Maasai history is particularly interesting because the Maasai say in their histories that the gods gave us the cattle to look after, and that was our job, to look after the cattle for the gods. And the cattle were taken from Egypt right down into Africa by the Maasai. Now, this is additional supporting evidence from the world's leading specialist in agricultural origins. Location of domestication. This is Frank Hall, Yale University archaeologist who specialises in early agriculture, thinks the major centre for early plant domestication was more likely in the corridor running north from the Dead Sea to Damascus. Its Mediterranean-type climate, dry summers and mild but wet winters, which prevailed at the time of agricultural origins, would have favoured the growth of annual plants like barley and both einkorn and emmer wheat. The Jericho site produced early evidence of barley cultivation. Commenting on this new research, Hull said in an interview that the location of domestication can't be determined by the present distribution of wild plants. For example, einkorn does not grow wild today around Abu Huraira, though excavations show that it must have more than 10,000 years ago. So it cannot be assumed, he said, that wild einkorn was growing in southeast Turkey at the time of domestication. I'm going to come to this now next, because it's a very important point. Whereabouts do we have the cut-off point where we had domestication, north-south of Damascus? And this is from O. Joseph, the Peabody Museum, Department of Anthropology, Harvard University, Cambridge, Massachusetts. And this is what he says. Second, there is a general agreement on the identification of the Younger Dryas, whether in marine sediments, lake cores, or speleothems. The conditions prevailing during the Younger Dryas are crucial in interpreting the archaeological remains. And unfortunately, the dating of this period in the Near East is not without difficulties. According to the ice cores, the Younger Dryas lasted from 12,900 to 11,600, and that's before present. While the Var sequence of Lake Van in eastern Turkey, this cold and dry period was longer by around 800 years. So we've got a very good reason to look south of Damascus for our agricultural origins and the site of agricultural origins, and not to consider anything north of Damascus as being realistic, because of the fact that the earth was warming up after some 40% being frozen, and the ice began to clear from the south towards the North Pole, and the plants, the seeds and the animals all marched north as the planet warmed up. Jared Diamond said agriculture took a firm hold in the ancient Middle East because of the diversity of plants and animals suitable for domestication. Whatever the factors behind its origins, the first farmers, he said in the journal article, quickly assembled a balanced package of domesticates meeting all of humanity's basic needs: carbohydrate, protein, oil, milk, animal transport and traction, and vegetable and animal fibre for rope and clothing. It was a complete package, arriving at the same place at the same time. This wasn't an accident, this was a deliberate planting of agriculture from an earlier civilization, a very advanced civilization, who made it all possible for this restart at this particular time, around 9,600. Again, David Harris writes, domesticated barley and wheat are present outside the range of their wild progenitors. At Murgar in western Pakistan, by around circa 5,300 BC, and the early Neolithic package of cereals, pulses, goats and sheep appears at numerous sites on the Thessalian plain in eastern Greece during the 7th millennium BC. Thus the evidence as a whole points strongly to the conclusion that agriculture developed throughout Western Eurasia not as a result of a series of independent shifts from foraging to farming, by a process of diffusion from a single area of origin in the fertile present. Key research here features Bradley T. Lepper, a curator of archaeology at the Ohio Historical Society. Tom Dillehay, an archaeologist with the Vanderbilt University, and several colleagues announced last month in the journal Science that they had recovered remarkably early evidence for agriculture in South America. Working at several sites in the Nacho Valley in northern Peru, they found squash seeds that were more than 9,000 years old. This is nearly twice as old as previously reported farming evidence in the region. Dillehay and his co-authors point out that one of the most important aspects of this discovery is that horticulture and cultural complexity developed in the Americas nearly as early as it did in many parts of the world. And again, given that civilizations of the Old World and New World developed independently, which was the view we had and still have with many people, there is no reason to expect that peoples on opposite sides of the globe all would adopt agriculture within a short period of time. And yet, we've known for some time that they did. Mark Nathan Cohen, anthropologist at the State University of New York, wrote in 1977 that the problem is not just to account for the beginnings of agriculture, but to account for the fact that so many human populations made this economic transition in so short a time. This was something that happened worldwide within 2,000 years of starting the settlement at Karsag and Jericho. The progenitors of the Meso-Indians gave the world not only cacao, but a whole range of other crops, which you can see on these lists. Quite extraordinary. Although we've now found, and you're going to see a little later, that some of these crops may well have been domesticated and taken to the Americas. And Peter Tompkins says here, to have developed such produce and animals would have been the work of thousands of years. Now the last of the specialists in agriculture on this list is Steve Gagne, and these were his conclusions in his very specialised work, which is of great interest. And I'm just going to read out the two key paragraphs here. Genetic manipulation of plants, particularly cereal grains, occurred at some point in prehistory by people who had already had the knowledge to do so. These same people created a vital and lasting human food source, no doubt for very specific reasons. In each of the major areas of the world where plants and animals were domesticated, we find legends, both written and oral, describing the origin of agriculture as a gift of the gods, culture bearers who taught indigenous peoples agriculture and the sciences of civilization. Could this possibly be coincidence, the accident, or mere imagination? Our ancestors left us more than bones, seeds, stone tools, priestly cults, ritualistic incantations to exotic gods. They left us examples of extraordinary feats of engineering, architecture, and sustainable methods of agriculture. They left us legends, myths, epics, and sagas. Isn't it about time we heard them out? So let's go on with the domestication, and we pick up the point of Peter Tompkins that it must have been the work of thousands of years of development. That's one way of looking at it, or incredibly intelligent people, but there must have been the 1,000 years of development behind it. It doesn't make any sense for agriculture to have taken so long to arrive. I think what we're looking at is the fact that the planet's climate has been so hostile that agriculture was literally wiped out time and time again. And that's something we need to think about today, and what the risks are from cometary debris and massive disruptions from solar flares, etc., etc., and look at the historical record, see what happened in the past, and take sensible measures to mitigate any future problems. Now the conventional, as a contradictory view, the domestication is a two-step process. Number one, cultivation, choosing and bringing a wild plant or animal into management. Two, selection, the different reproduction or variants of these plants to suit better the needs of humans. This may be an unconscious action, for example by selection of non-shattering in grains, because this character will be increased with hand harvesting, and similarly selection or extension of juvenile state in animals is achieved naturally by selecting for non-aggressive animals. However, as a result of changes wrought by selection, many crop plants have been so changed that for many of them their origins are obscure, with no extant close wild relative. Some no longer appear outside cultivation and become new types of cultigens. Maize and cabbage are two examples. But as a conventional view, quite a sensible conventional view, if you don't get your head around the fact that there was an advanced civilization with incredible knowledge. The arrival of plant and animal domestication at the boundary between PPNA, pre-pottery Neolithic A, and pre-pottery Neolithic B in the Levantine Corridor. This is where we're heading. We want to look at what suddenly happened between those two archaeological boundaries. Plants. In the first instance, a unique ecology was required. In the Levantine Corridor, wild barley, wild wheat, olives, pistachio, oak and other plants and animals, such as deer, foxes and antelope, had survived in what is termed a glacial refuge. Before you can farm, and even consider farming, there are 15 basic acts of husbandry which were required for a static community with supporting food and water to produce and distribute plant food harvests. That required detailed knowledge and skilled supervision within a large settlement or town. Now I put together these 15 basic acts of husbandry for each of you to think about what is involved if you wanted to start farming from scratch. Number one, drainage. Number two, tillage, minimum of preparation for pure stands. Soil fertility, correcting acidity with lime, phosphate and potash, the nitrogen cycle, the required minerals. Raising and storing new stock of domesticated seeds for each crop. Translocation, moving the seeds, the size of the seed, planting and even germination. Competition, spacing the seed and weed control, enough of it, enough volume to be worthwhile. Irrigation, a supply of water through the growing season and applying it and providing it. Plant manipulation such as pruning. Pest and disease control. Rotation of crops between different fields. Accommodation of animal stock. You don't want your animals breaking into the field and knocking over the crops, and the beehives, and I'm going to come to that in a minute, which is the story on the Phaistos disc. Again, pollination, and that's where the bees come in. Manual with some crops. Certainly dates were deliberately and manually pollinated with little brushes, and this is what you see the Abkalu, as they're called, and I'll come to that later, in the Assyrian room of the British Museum. This is what they're doing, they're pollinating crops. And of course the making of the availability of bees and all the other insects that help pollinate plants. Fencing, walling of crop area for protection, absolutely crucial. You have to protect your crops from the wild animals that might get in and cause havoc. You have to think about harvesting. The ratchet's strength is quite a remarkable. This is on the stalk where the grain are held. So that when you hit the grain, they all fall off the ratchets, so you can harvest it. But if they do what it does in nature with a wild plant, the seeds all fall off on the ground before you get there to harvest it. So that's a crucial thing, and this is the miracle of the ratchet's strength. And of course, even ripening, having plants to even ripen evening, so that when you harvest it, they're all available at ripening at the same time. In the old days we used to make stooks that helped even or even ripening, but if you put stooks out in the field and it rained, you have problems. And the seed needs to be left clean. So there is all harvesting features. And when you've harvested your crops, you have to think about storage of the harvest, grain storage, looking after what is harvested. We find the earliest grain stores at Jericho. And to end all these key points, the 15th point is actually having skilled supervision on every single one of those very important technical issues. Now the consequences of farming success, which is those 15 basic skills that are required, and of course very good supervision, training everybody, being able to deal with the complete package. What it actually does, that success, it provides a year-round dietary availability on at least 10 staple crops, principally grains, 5 of which fix nitrogen and could be grown in rotation. 10 of the founder domesticated crops, emmer wheat, einkorn, barley, lentil, pea, bitter vetch, chickpea, linseed and figs were all fantastically balanced together. And you'll see in a minute when I'm going to cover that point. There was little reason why this diet of staple crops could not be supplemented by hunting, fishing and foraging, or buying or exchanging such projects in the marketplace. In other words, you had a wonderful complete package. Now the important collagen food crops, on which something like, in fact, 8.5 billion people depend or will depend in a few years' time, are rice, wheat, maize, sorghum, millet and barley. They're all grass products, they all grow like grass. And if you add grazing of grasses from the equator to the Arctic Circle, you've got the wildebeest, if you like, on the African plains, etc., and you've got the geese feeding on the grass in the Arctic Circle. And you've got in Britain the best conditions for converting grass into meat on our uplands of Wales and Scotland and the Pennines. And those areas produce grass to meat without the addition of all the various concentrates which people complain about, and where you have soya bean being grown on areas which were rainforests, Amazon rainforests, and where you've got cattle being produced for meat in areas which were rainforests, and we have totally underutilised our British grassland. Very important. We can produce 10 times as much in terms of carrying capacity for sheep, cattle and wildlife if we manage our uplands in Britain properly. And this just emphasises how stupid we've been in allowing politicians to decide how our farming is run in Britain over the last 14 years. The unavoidable conclusion is evidence of an advanced civilization in the creation of domesticated crops and animals, which arrive around the same time in the Levantine Corridor, around 9600 BC. That technology and seeds are taken around the world in the course of the next 2,000 years by these culture bearers, whose names live on as angels, Engeli, which means Lord of the Cultivation, and watchers. Alternatively, the Ab-Ka-Lu, which means the bright farmers from the enclosure. You can go and see them in the Assyrian room at the British Museum. And this is Enoch's, back to Enoch again, and Enoch describes the angels. And he says their clothes were remarkable, being purplish with the appearance of feathers, and on their shoulders were things that I can only describe like golden wings. Now we can speculate on the folk memory or reason for wings being attached to the images of the Ab-Ka-Lu, or angels. We have important clues of their origin or mistaken identity from Enoch above, and the image on the right of a traditional feathered coat of people of rank, in this case a Maori princess wearing one in 1921. And remember the stories about the feathered serpent, serpent meaning wise person in the Americas. So now we go into some of the little bit more detail for the academics and scientists who want to look seriously into the material that I'm presenting, just as simply to show you just how complicated agriculture is and how this wasn't the result of one or a few simple mutations that suddenly arrived at the time. Wild and domesticated seeds are completely different. The fat domesticated wheat grain between wild ones and an ancient relic. Much of the research and dating is done from the ancient relics, which is pretty difficult. The miracle of wheat. The miracle of wheat begins with wild emmer and einkorn, early grains that have small, tough seeds that cannot be effectively processed for food or easily digested by humans. Yet somehow, Stone Age farmers grasped that if they kept harvesting and culling and replanting the largest of these useless seeds, eventually they would produce larger, softer seeds that could be harvested, processed and digested by progeny of dozens of generations removed from them. Such a high level of selfless dedication to the future is clearly not possible today, so it seems equally unlikely 10,000 years. That's from the late Lloyd Pye, who made marvellous contributions to our greater knowledge of our ancestors. He says again here, the miracle of rachis, which is the stalk on which the grains sit on, and the glooms, which are the barbs. Now you want to thrash the grain, which means you have to cut it, harvest it, take it home, and then thrash it. What you don't want to do is have the grain all falling all over the ground before you get to harvest it. And so this subtle difference in the rachis is crucial. And the same with the barbs on the grain, or the long awns. These are there for a wild seeds to be picked up by animals, blown in the wind, so that the wild seed can march north as it would have done then, and did do. And those were traits which made it very difficult to actually grow the wild seeds, along with all the others. So the rachises of domesticated wheat have been altered to be exactly durable enough to withstand harvesting, but also altered to release when thrashing. These exact modifications seem entirely too precise to be accidental. The same occurs in several other wild plants to produce domesticated plants. A second major clue from Lloyd Pye about the sophistication of agriculture. Wonderful images here, the cylinder seal impression of a Nippur tablet at the bottom, which is the 3-man team, and the 2-man team above, and there's a man putting the seed down the spout. Now what you could do with that, and what they were doing thousands and thousands of years, was precisely placing the seed at the right depth and the right spacing in order for crops to grow properly. Precision seeding, but then it was done by hand. We now have machines to do that, and we have to have machines to do it. So it's a fabulous image here of just how sophisticated and skilled and how much common sense was applied by our ancestors. I've included the Phaistos disc. This was a very important part of Christian O'Brien's work in going back to the original, oldest Indo-European picture language, and it tells the story of the cattle of the great lords breaking out of the field, knocking over the fences, knocking over the beehives, everybody going mad, calling for the headman and getting everybody back to round them up and push them back into the field and fence them in again. And it's something like, little boy blue, come blow your horn, the sheep are in the meadow, the cows are in the corn. Where is the little boy tending the sheep? He's under the haystack fast asleep. So it's a similar theme to that. And this was found, it's only about 6 inches in size, and it's called the Phaistos disc, and it was found in Crete at Phaistos. And we're so stupid these days, we even sit down and call this a fraudulent object, and it's not taken seriously. Quite extraordinary. I spoke to the British Museum about it and said, oh, it's a fraud, it's a forgery. They forge all sorts of artefacts, and some of them are sums of money. All the Greeks have to do is drill a hole in the side, take out the clay and date it. Nobody wants to do it, they're frightened to. Interesting, isn't it? Now what I've got here is a beehive. If you look at the bottom of the Phaistos disc, there's a beehive, which is evidence that our ancestors pollinated using bees, the oldest hive and the most important process of any kind of gardening operation. In addition to that, we have the head of a man, and that's one of the great lords in the poem. And if you were a lord or a king, you wore a hat like that. It's like a Mahitian haircut. And when Captain Cook arrived in Hawaii, then he was handed a feathered cap, and the one you see at the bottom of this diagram, and I'm going to show the blow up on the next page, because the Hawaiians thought that the white man who was visiting them was a king, and they held the memory of the Shining Ones way back for thousands of years. And that is the beehive. It's very blurred because I've had to blow it up enormously, but you can see the detail is there. That's honeycomb on top, shape of a honeycomb. There's a platform for the bees to land on, and the legs for the hive to sit on. And you couldn't mistake that for anything else other than a beehive. This is what the pictorial language did. You looked at it long enough, and most sensible people with spatial knowledge said, oh, that's a beehive, no trouble. Crucial for pollinating crops at Karsag at 9,400, and this is where this story comes from. This is the feathered helmet symbol of kingship from the time of the Shining Ones, given to Captain Cook on his arrival in Hawaii. And that was before his crew sold the Hawaiians knives, and the Hawaiians ended up by putting a knife into Captain Cook because he wasn't up to what they thought the gods were like. Sad, isn't it? Hawaii's mystery cotton. The Hawaiian island chain is the world's most isolated. The nearest continental landfall is San Francisco, 2,500 miles away. Whatever plants, animals and people arrived in the Lake Islands, they did so by conquering awesome distances. Yet when Captain Cook landed in 1778, Hawaiian cotton, a wild hybrid species with one set of chromosomes from a New World cotton and the other from Old World cotton, was already well established. How did it get to be a hybrid, and how did it get to Hawaii? Crucial information and support. These are changes from wild species to domesticated crops. Gathered plants in the first form of wild plants. Present-day examples of species that are still gathered in various parts of the world include blueberry, Brazil nut, chicle, Indian rice, rubber, sugar maple. However, wild plants have become distinctly different from cultivated plants. The change from wild to cultivated crops is characterized by a number of gross genetic changes. Hybridization is unique to early human occupation sites. I checked that out with our leading botanist in this country, and he tells me that all our botanists know that hybridization is extremely special, and the ancients did it well. And we're back to Shemjaza and his root cuttings. They knew how to hybridize plants. We don't yet know how to produce reliable seeds from these plants. So we haven't yet cracked with our modern technology how they achieved the perfect hybridization. Fact of life. And one day the botanists will be brave enough to tell the world that. I want to now look at the sites where the earliest domesticated crops have so far been found. And that will give us more clues to pushing us closer in our search to the Karsag site. 25 miles east from Karsag lies Tel Aswad, close to Damascus, which occupied an important position in the fertile plain on the route between the Jordan Valley and the Middle Euphrates. At Tel Aswad we've got the first known to have domesticated crops, particularly Emma wheat. 8,800 BC is the date put on it by the archaeobotanist, very important man, William van Zeist, and he tested Emma wheat seeds from Tel Aswad and dated them, the earliest domesticated examples, at 8,800 he uses BCE, which I use BC, showing Tel Aswad to be the first settlement to have tended domesticated crops. The social explosion of settlements around this date of the Pottery Neolithic B horizon, and I pointed the explosion of settlements earlier, which was formerly called the second stage of the PBNA, was a direct result of domestication of emmer wheat and slightly later barley, one of the most important developments in our culture. Later excavations at Aswad by Contensons successor, this is a separate paper provided by Daniel Slaughter, have abolished the Aswadian phrase. And I said earlier, Aswadian phrase now doesn't exist, so we're talking about the Sultanian. And they redated the entire PMBB back to the rise around 8000 BCE to align with the first detected domestication. The PPNA being reduced somewhere between 9,600 and 8,800. What I'm saying, and all the research I'm presenting, is we will find that the date of the first domestication will go back to around about 9,500, 9,600, where we already have some of our crops, and I'm going to come to those. Tel Aswad, Sioux College, University College London, gives dates for the earliest domesticated cereal use at Tel Aswad at approximately the same figure that's spread, but it was proven to be 8,800 on the samples they tested. This is preceded by an earlier and smaller cave site called Iraq el-Dub in Jordan, which apparently shows evidence of domesticated cereals, possibly as far back as 9,600. So the trend is going there amongst the professionals. Tel Aswad, again, very important points by Jacques Cauvin, clarifies that Aswad was not the centre for the origin of agriculture, stating that its first inhabitants arrived perhaps from the neighbouring Lebanon, which is where Karsag is, already equipped with the seeds for planting, which is what I'm trying to suggest. For their practice of agriculture from the inception of a settlement is not in doubt. Thus it was not in the oasis itself that they carried out their first experiments in farming. Now this is Wadi El Gilead 7, the earliest known domestication of einkorn wheat, very, very important, and this is in Jordan and not Turkey. What we're talking about in Turkey by a lot of the scientists is wild wheats, or einkorn wheat which have taken much later to those areas where the seeds went. And Wadi El Gilead is an archaeological site containing an early Neolithic archaeological site 55 kilometres southwest of Azra in modern-day Jordan. The earliest domesticated grains of einkorn wheat known so far to humanity were found at this site and radiocarbon dated to 9,500 to 9,200 before present, which is 7,000 Cauvin. We have had this issue of these dates, the earliest dates we have, and we know that we eventually will push those dates back. But the key point is that the earliest known domestication of einkorn wheat, the other very important wheat, is Jordan, not Turkey. The earliest known barley dated near Jericho in the Jordan Valley. Its Mediterranean-type climate, dry summers and mild but wet winters which prevailed at the time of agricultural origins would have favoured growth of annual plants like barley and both einkorn and emmer wheat. The Jericho site produced early evidence of barley cultivation. This is back to Frank Hall, a Yale University archaeologist who specialises in early agriculture. Again, on the earliest einkorn wheat at Jericho, further commentary on Tel Aswad. The earliest populated evidence of einkorn wheat at Jericho was not dated until at least 500 years later than Aswad's emmer. Flax seeds were also present. Fruit, figs and pistachios were apparently very popular because they were found in large quantities. Stationary containers of mud and stone were found with carbonized grain found on the interior of one, designating them as silos. Tel Aswad have been cited as being of importance for the evolution of organised cities, due to the appearance of building materials, organised plans and collective work. It's provided insight into the explosion of knowledge in the northern Levant during the PP and the Neolithic stage following dam construction. Aswad has been suggested to be amongst the 10 probable centres of the origins of agriculture. That's another independent statement on what's going on, which backs up what I'm saying. This is barley cultivation, Netiv Hagdud. Abstract here is Netiv Hagdud is an early Neolithic village site in the lower Jordan Valley. Systematic excavations exposed 500 square metre surface, which included several oval and circular houses. Carbonized plant remains, animal bones and well-prolific assemblies were the primary materials recovered from the houses and the fill. The seeds indicate that barley cultivation was practiced along with the continuous gathering of wild fruits and seeds. Gazelle hunting and trapping of migratory wildfowl provided the major meat sources. The lithic industry, classified as the Sultanian, is characterised by the presence of game points, blades and tranchets, which is axes, and is similar to that uncovered at Jericho. Another broad description of important things happening here. I put this slide in, I've produced this before in the earlier Learning from History series, and it was domesticated maize pollen, which is found in a dry lake core bed and just north, not very close to Carsag. The sample was dated at 7,500 BC by leading Dutch archaeologists, bioarchaeologists, Botemar and Zeist, close to Carsag. And I've already mentioned Zeist. These were the top people in their field, and when they came up with this evidence of maize from a lake core bed or dry lake core bed, the experts said it was impossible, and they lost their reputations on the strength of that discovery. Maize has now been found, so they've been proved absolutely right at Tel Rama, east of Mount Hermon, and at Dartmoor, England, dated at 4,200 BC. Wheat in the New World. We're told wheat and barley, we can't find them in the New World, but a lot of scientists think there's a reason for that. While organic artefacts of wheat have not been and may not ever be found in the New World, analysis of inorganic opaline plant microfossils called phytophiths, forgive my pronunciation, may yet reveal evidence of pre-Columbian wheat cultivation. Researchers are currently developing phytophith classification paradigms of old world cereals in an effort to produce research tools to explore the possibility. So what they're saying is that they've got a pretty good idea that wheat and barley are in the New World, and they will eventually be able to identify them. This is crucial to this whole talk because we actually find something really solid at 9,400 BC, which is the oldest recorded domesticated fig, found at 8 miles north of Jericho at Gilgal 1 in the Jordan Rift Valley below Carsag, southern Lebanon. This ancient carbonized fig, dried for human consumption and discovered 8 miles north of Jericho at Gilgal 1, proved to have been a domesticated mutant selectively propagated by local people 11,400 years ago. In this variety of fig, known as a parthenocarpic, the fruit develops without insect pollination and is prevented from falling off the tree, allowing it to ripen. This edible fig would not have survived if not for human intervention. Very important point. We see this with the fig and many other plants, that if it wasn't for humans pollinating them and managing them as they would their garden plants, they wouldn't have survived. Now this is really interesting because we now got to Jericho in the Jordan Valley, which helps give an enormous additional support to the arguments being put in this presentation. Jericho was the benchmark for dating and examining the arrival of an advanced civilization at the start of the Holocene. It's the wholly recent period at the end of the Younger Dryas Ice Age. That's Jericho location, a view from the south. The Dead Sea is in the south when we're looking at a modern city of Jericho. This is Jacques Chauvin again, Jericho in the Jordan Valley north of the Dead Sea. It is in the three cultural groups in the Levant, the Sultanian, the Aswadian and Maribetan, among whom appeared the first signs of an agricultural economy. Now, I've already addressed the fact that Aswadian and the Maribetan have been taken off the list, and we're looking now at the Sultanian. And I'm mentioning this for the sake of the students, so we can try and clarify the stages and the changes that have been made to feature and hone in on Jericho itself. The Sultanian will thus be found close to the natural habitat of wheat and barley, but not firmly within it. Now, much of the seeds may well have been collected at Carsag, which is near Mount Hermon, which is at the Aswadian end of the chain of the Levantine Corridor, which helps explain some of this. I hope you're still following me. The inhabitants of Aswad were first to occupy this location. They arrived, perhaps from the neighbouring Anti-Lebanon, already equipped with domestic seed planting. That's repeating what I've said. Earliest Jericho settlement, 10,000 BC. Jericho has evidence of settlement dating back to 10,000, and this takes us back to Natufian. During the Younger Dryas period of cold and drought, permanent habitation of any one location was not possible. However, the spring at what would become Jericho was a popular camping ground for the Natufian hunter-gatherer groups, who left a scattering of present microlith tools behind them. Jericho, the first permanent settlement. As the world warmed, a new culture based on agriculture and sedentary dwelling emerged, which the archaeologists have termed pre-pottery Neolithic age. Pre-pottery Neolithic age villages are characterised by small circular buildings, burials of the dead within the floors of the buildings, and reliance on hunting wild game. The cultivation of wild or possibly domestic cereals and no use of pottery. So the questions are still a little vague, but I hope you'll understand why I'm putting this information in for students to really get to grips with what I'm talking about. At Jericho, circular dwellings were built of clay and straw bricks left to dry in the sun, which were plastered together with mud and water. Each house measured 5 metres across and was roofed with mud-smeared brush. Halves were located within and outside the homes. And I'm going to come back because where we had this expansion of agriculture, many of the local people were still living in those circular buildings, and the elite were living in rectangular shaped buildings on a completely different level of what one might call comfort. By about 9,400 BC, the town had grown to more than 70 modest dwellings. Estimates put the population as high as 2,000 to 3,000 people and as low as 200 to 300. Most strikingly, this early town featured a massive stone wall over 12 feet high and 5 feet 11 inches wide at the base. Inside this wall stood a tower over 28 feet high, containing internal staircase with 22 stone steps. The wall and the tower have no known precedent in human culture and would have taken 100 men more than 100 days to construct. The wall may have served as a defence against floodwater, with the tower used for ceremonial purposes. This is a comment from recognised archaeologists, and it's this sudden change. All of a sudden we go from the round houses to very sophisticated rectangular houses in this tower and stonework. It is not simply coincidence that the extension of Jericho to an area of 2 acres is accompanied by building activities of a new type. A communal architecture implies a cooperation in tasks with a collective purpose. No continuity was observed between PPNA and PPNB at Jericho. The round houses of very poor weaponry and tools of the former contrasted greatly with the rectangular houses with lime-plastered floors and the rich panoply of the latter. Kathleen Kenyon, and she was the great archaeologist who was the first to really properly excavate Jericho, attributed all these innovations to newcomers arriving at the site. So there was no gap between PPNA and PPNB. There was a sudden change, and that's a key point for everybody to realise, and that adds evidence to the presentation I'm putting forward. Now, the distinct advanced transitions at Jericho at this boundary, around about 9,600, was a move to square or rectangular houses, invention or manufacture of quality lime for plaster and correcting soil acidity. Lime plaster that today survives on the Jericho Tower. We're going to look at that in a minute. Agriculture cannot be conducted unless you neutralise the acidity of the soil, and lime is required for that purpose. We have the population rising to 300 people or more. Use of a 28-foot tower for astronomical observations. This is research from Jerusalem University, which I'm going to come to. Dressed stonework, which would not have disgraced the best medieval castle. Double entry keeping tokens for food items delivered to the settlement by the surrounding farmers. That's the Smant Bassarat tokens. The first example of double entry bookkeeping. A 27-foot wide and 9-foot deep ditch cut into the bedrock around the town. That's the same dimensions as the Carsag watercourse. Outside the wall as flood defence and irrigation system from the Ain as Sultan Spring, where the water flows, the same quantity of water flows today as it would have flowed right back to this 9,600 start date. Sophisticated wall around the town with the use of local bitumen to waterproof it as it was constructed to prevent the settlement from being flooded at such a low elevation in the Rift Valley. The 28-foot tower had a dressed stone staircase giving access from the top of the wall down into the town. We're going to look at that in a minute. The town was built at a point where major trading routes met for salt and bitumen, and irrigated crops were successfully sown in the warmer climate, the sheltered 670 feet below sea level. That's the wonderful image of the excavation. And Kathleen Kenyon's trench, and that was the middle right, not far from the top of the city. That is a drawing, a brick-walled city of Jericho as it appeared when Joshua first saw it. And you can see the massive ditch of the original Jericho outlined in the area, so that the original structure was very much larger than the brick-walled city of Jericho very much later. Now this is extraordinary work by Mr. Barkai and Mr. Liran in 2008, and they looked at the Neolithic Tower of Jericho and said it was one of the earliest stone-built monuments in the history of humankind. It was constructed 11,000 years ago within a village of settled hunter-gatherers on the threshold of transition to agriculture, food production and growing social complexity. Since its discovery, the tower was conceived by archaeologists and the public as the oldest manifestation of the new Neolithic order, but its specific purpose, as well as the mechanism behind its construction and function, remained undeciphered. That is the tower. The lime plaster is still there. All these buildings that use lime plaster, it's got to be high quality lime plaster, but it's still to be there after getting on for 11,000 years. Midsummer sunset at Jericho. The markers on the hill and the tower showed the midsummer sunset on June the 21st and the different times of the day. And they worked all that precisely out with computers. So our ancestors were very good observers of the sun, the moon and the stars, which is exactly what we're told in that extract from the books of Enoch, with the watchers carrying out all those particular roles. And we're talking about the watchers being here. And there's the position of the setting sun on the conical peak, so that they lined it all up so they could use it as an observational astronomy marker. A section through the tower where these, which would not disgrace a medieval castle according to Catherine Kendall, and it was clearly designed as flood defences. You can see the ditch on the outside there. You can easily clamber up that wall and then you go down into the compound by going down the staircase. Now they would have had all sorts of ways of getting produce into the town, but they kept that flood-proof structure right the way around the perimeter of Jericho so they could withstand the worst flood. And there are all sorts of reasons why they had to have regular floods, which could have wiped the whole settlement out if they hadn't planned for it. So the planning of that was a crucial part of the advanced knowledge of the people who built it. And here Kenyon talks about the roof of large slabs, hammer dressed to a flat surface. And this tower would not disgrace one of the more grandiose medieval castles. She also commented that the labour involved in excavating the ditch out of solid rock must have been tremendous, as we have discovered nothing in the way of heavy flint picks. One can only suppose it was carried out with stone walls, perhaps helped by splitting with foreign mortar. And we know from the sophistication of the Shining Ones at Carsag, they were using very advanced technology to create these watercourses. This wasn't primitive stuff, this was highly sophisticated modern technology, as modern as their ability to deliver domesticated crops. and I said here, the most obvious archaeological remains were where the earliest domesticated seeds were grown are the ancient roundhouse sites, which are clearly seen on the ground close to the Karsag site in Rashaya Basin. If you're looking for where people really expanded, then you need to look for the remains of the roundhouse sites, which were the people growing the crops out in the field, so to speak, and maybe 4 or 5 miles away from Karsag and all the outlying areas from where the research centre had delivered all the crops. Little archaeological work has been done in this area, the southern Lebanon area, since wild emmer was first identified from samples collected amongst wild barley by Theodore Kodziski in Rashaya in 1879. Those are what the roundhouses look like, and we need to look for the remains of those in the Lebanon where there's no real archaeological research being done. Another picture there. These are all from Professor Graham Barker and his book The Agricultural Revolution in Prehistory. And this is a comment by Paul Bedson, who works for the Golden Age Project, a key figure with me on these issues. He went out there and did the site survey with Carl Guilford, and he says this: circular earth bank suggesting semi-subterranean houses similar to the PPNA Netiv Hagud. A large number of structures in north and south of the Ahia Plain suggests hundreds, if not thousands, of inhabitants. Large number of group structures north of the suggested watercourse. Illustrations from Google Earth show damage to the site between 2003 and 2010. One of the many possible ancient roundhouses on the unexcavated Karnhag site. This is a photograph by Paul Bedson. The Karun culture and the heavy Neolithic of Lebanon, 5 miles from Karsag. This is Paul again. He's done all the research, put loads of stuff on Wikipedia, and spent hours trying to pin down the kind of evidence we want to get you, the people, to say that this is worthy of a proper investigation by the archaeological establishment, please. 10 years ago, in 2004, the curator of the Lebanese Museum of Prehistory, Meir Hadar Bustani, wrote about the chronological dating of the Karun culture in Lebanon. This chronological problem needs to be discussed in future when reliable data will be forthcoming. In other words, we need to do the research to deal with this. Recent studies on the flint workshops of the Levant, which is somebody called Barkai and Taut, will hopefully enable us to fit the heavy Neolithic of Lebanon into a general context. This is the message for the archaeologists who we want to get to work on this area. And the Karun culture, heavy Neolithic axes and heavy Neolithic pick, around about 9,400 BC, would have required some very large people to use them effectively. Anyway, that's another story and something for more research. Without an answer to the question of chronological context of the Karun culture, we cannot place this culture accurately. The only record we have is their tools, the axes and picks they used to clear trees for agriculture. Without establishment of a dating of these tools, mankind and science will continue to speculate in the face of overwhelming evidence that it was the Karun culture who was involved in the domestication of our first crops and helped to start our first villages and beginnings of civilization, which then spread out to Jericho in Israel, Aswan in Syria, and Moribad in Turkey, with the introduction of the first farming to the world. Now, the aims of our research project, the Golden Age Research Project, is we seek permission and support from the Lebanese authorities to carry out a preliminary survey and investigation in the Rashad South Basin and surrounding area. We actually did that without asking permission. If we'd asked permission, we wouldn't have got there. We also seek to encourage the Lebanese authorities, and where necessary others, to assist in planning and organising the necessary archaeological and environmental studies to substantiate the evidence gathered through the research and translations of the ancient texts by the authors of the Genius of the Few, Christian and Barbara J. O'Brien. We asked the British Museum, and they said it was a matter for the Lebanese, nothing to do with the British Museum. To discover whether there are physical features and dated farming evidence to establish beyond reasonable doubt the actual Karsag or Garden of Eden as portrayed in the Sumerian, Arabic and Hebraic literature at this site. And the report, full report, was first submitted to the Lebanese authorities in September 2007 by me. The Karsag Garden of Eden site is now under the protection of the Association for the Protection of Lebanese Heritage. And if you look that up, you'll see there it's on their list of protected sites. So people in the Lebanon are beginning to move on this, which is marvellous. The British Museum were first provided with the Genius of the Few and the Shining Ones in 1999, 15 years ago, and now hold all the O'Brien thesis evidence, including his last book, which is called The Path of Light. Those are the two books, and that is the end of this presentation. And we will be going on with Learning from History Part 16, which will deal specifically with Göbekli Tepe and Baalbek, which are closely linked to Jericho and Karsag. Thank you for listening.